In the heart of a snowbound valley, nestled between jagged mountains cloaked in eternal frost, there was a village veiled in ancient secrets. The air was heavy with whispers, of tales spun by firelight, of promises made in silence, and of a tree whose name was not spoken lightly, the wish tree. Few in the village dared to believe in it openly, yet none could ignore the pull of the legend. The elders told of it in murmurs, their voices trembling with awe. The tree, they said, stood in the shrouded forest, a place where the world of men brushed against something older and far less forgiving. Its roots burrowed deep into the earth, as if feeding on the dreams buried there. Its branches reached skyward, adorned with silver leaves that glimmered under the moonlight like fragments of shattered stars. The wish tree was no ordinary tree. It was alive with ancient magic, a force that answered to neither mercy nor malice, but to the truth of one's heart. But its gift came with a price. To stand before the tree, the stories claimed, was to face not only the weight of your desire, but also the depths of your soul. The forest it resided in was treacherous, filled with shadows that moved when unlooked upon, and paths that twisted themselves into riddles. Few who entered the shrouded forest returned, and those who did spoke of strange sights, of voices that beckoned from the trees, of memories that felt as real as the ground beneath their feet. And at the heart of it all stood the wish tree, waiting for those who dared to seek it. Its magic stirred, but once a year, on Christmas Eve, when the world hung in the delicate balance between the old and the new, when the boundaries between longing and fulfillment thinned, on that night the tree would listen. To those brave enough to find it, it would grant one wish, but only one, and only if the wish was true. The legend had persisted for generations, woven into the fabric of the village, like the snow that never melted from its rooftops. Some dismissed it as a tale to entertain children. Others kept their belief locked away, whispering their desires into the cold wind each Christmas Eve, hoping against hope. But the forest remained untouched, the path to the wish tree shrouded in silence and fear. That year, Christmas Eve arrived with a peculiar stillness. Snow fell in soft, deliberate flurries, as though the world itself held its breath. In a small cottage at the edge of the village, 3 friends gathered. They were bound not by blood, but by shared years and unspoken dreams, each carrying a wish they would not voice aloud. Mara, her dark hair framing a face etched with quiet sorrow, clutched a locket that never left her neck. Elias, the storyteller, sat by the fire, his fingers stained with ink, and his eyes alight with visions of worlds he would never see. And Finn, the quietest of the 3, gazed out the frost-covered window at the stars, his thoughts locked behind an impenetrable wall. The legend of the wish tree was familiar to all of them, but never had they spoken of seeking it. It was a story, a myth, something to stir the imagination but never the feet. And yet, on this night, something stirred in the air. A presence that could not be ignored. A knock echoed through the small room, startling them from their thoughts. It was not the knock of a visitor, but something deeper, more resonant, as though the very bones of the house had been struck. Mara opened the door, her breath catching in her throat. Outside, the snow swirled in a ghostly dance, and standing in its midst was a cloaked figure. Their face was obscured, but their hand extended toward Mara, holding a slender branch adorned with leaves of silver that shimmered faintly in the pale moonlight. "The tree awaits," the figure intoned, their voice low and resonant, as though it carried the weight of centuries. Before Mara could speak, the figure was gone, fading into the storm like a shadow swallowed by the night. The three friends exchanged glances, uncertainty and curiosity warring in their eyes. The branch lay on the threshold, its silver leaves catching the firelight with an otherworldly glow. In the silence, the legend they had always dismissed began to pulse with possibility, like a forgotten song rising to the surface. Mara was the first to speak. "What if it's true?" Her voice trembled with a mixture of fear and hope. Elias picked up the branch, turning it over in his hands. "If it is," he said, his voice soft, "then we must decide. Do we go?" Finn remained silent, his gaze still fixed on the stars. Then, without a word, he reached for his coat. The others followed, their lanterns casting faint circles of light as they stepped out into the cold. The path ahead was dark, the forest looming like a shadowed cathedral. But the wish tree awaited, and so, with hearts heavy and hopes fragile, they began their journey into the unknown. The wind grew sharper as Mara, Elias, and Finn stepped into the night, their footsteps muffled by the snow. The branch with its silver leaves glimmered faintly in Elias's hand, like a fragment of starlight meant to guide them. Yet no path presented itself. The forest at the edge of the village loomed before them, its trees towering like silent sentinels. The shrouded forest had no gates or boundaries, only an eerie sense that once you stepped beneath its canopy, you crossed into another realm. "Are we certain about this?" Mara asked, her voice trembling. She clutched the lantern close, its feeble light barely enough to pierce the darkness. Her locket, now hidden beneath her scarf, seemed to press against her skin, a constant reminder of what she sought. "No," Elias admitted, though a faint, reckless grin played at his lips. "But isn't that the point of a legend? To see if it's more than a story?" Finn said nothing, his silence as steady and enigmatic as the stars above. He simply took a step forward, and the others followed. The forest enveloped them almost at once. The air inside was heavy, thick with an unnatural quiet that swallowed the sound of their breathing and muffled the crunch of their boots. The lanterns cast weak pools of light, illuminating only fragments. the rough bark of ancient trees, the glint of frost on gnarled roots, the occasional swirl of mist that seemed to vanish as quickly as it appeared. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to shift around them. The trees grew closer, their branches intertwining overhead to form a labyrinth of shadows. Every so often, Mara thought she heard faint whispers, like voices carried on the wind. But when she turned, there was only the forest, vast and impenetrable. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias nodded, his hand tightening around the branch. "It's the stories," he said, as if that explained everything. "The ones the forest keeps." Mara frowned, but before she could question him further, Finn stopped abruptly. He turned his head slightly, his gaze fixed on something just beyond the light of the lanterns. Mara and Elias followed his gaze, but they saw nothing, only the endless stretch of trees. "What is it?" Mara asked. Finn didn't answer. Instead, he took a step toward the shadows, his movements deliberate but cautious. The others hesitated, glancing at each other before following. The light of their lanterns revealed nothing unusual, but Finn's eyes remained fixed ahead, as though he could see something they could not. Then the forest began to change. The shadows seemed to thicken, curling like smoke around their feet. The air grew colder, sharp with the tang of frost. Mara's breath caught as she saw something flicker at the edge of her vision. A figure, fleeting and translucent, darting between the trees. She froze, clutching Elias's arm. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Elias nodded, though his expression was unreadable. "Keep moving," he said, his voice unnaturally calm. As they pressed on, the flickering figures grew more frequent, their movements more deliberate. They were not merely shadows, but something more, echoes perhaps, of those who had come before. One by one, the friends began to hear voices, not loud or clear, but soft murmurs that seemed to rise from the very earth. "Mara," a voice whispered, barely audible but unmistakable. She stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding. It was her sister's voice, the one she had not heard since they were children. It was impossible, and yet it was there, threading through the air like a melody she had forgotten. "Mara, don't listen!" Elias called, his voice cutting through the haze. He reached for her, but before his hand could find hers, the shadows swirled around them, separating the three. Mara gasped as the forest shifted, the path dissolving into nothingness. She found herself alone, the lantern's light a fragile shield against the encroaching dark. "Elias! Finn!" she called, but her voice seemed to vanish before it reached her ears. The whispers grew louder, filling her head with fragments of her sister's laughter, her cries, her words. They called to her, drawing her forward despite her fear. The forest pulled at her, its shadows beckoning with promises of answers she had longed for. In the distance, she thought she saw the faint glow of the tree, the wish tree. Its branches shimmered, and for a moment all else faded. But as she took a step forward, a low growl stopped her in her tracks. From the darkness, golden eyes emerged, sharp and unyielding. A wolf stepped into the light of her lantern, its fur silver as the moon and its presence as ancient as the forest itself. "You seek the tree," it said, its voice deep and resonant, filling the silence like thunder. "But the forest does not give freely. What will you offer, child?" Mara's hand went instinctively to her locket, and she felt its weight, both physical and emotional. The wolf's gaze bore into her, and she knew then that the legend was no mere story. The wish tree awaited, but the price of reaching it had only begun to reveal itself. The wolf's golden eyes burned with an otherworldly intensity, as though it could see through Mara's very soul. Its growl rumbled low, reverberating in the heavy stillness. She could feel her pulse racing, her hand trembling as it rested on the locket beneath her scarf. It was a talisman of her memories, of her sister, an anchor she had clung to for years. "What do you mean, offer?" Mara asked, her voice wavering. The wolf tilted its head, its gaze unrelenting. "The wish tree is no simple giver. It demands sacrifice, something precious, something tied to your heart." The beast's words curled in the air like smoke, carrying a weight Mara could not ignore. Before she could respond, the shadows around her shifted again. Elias's voice broke through the darkness. "Mara!" She turned to see him stumble forward, his lantern casting uneven light. His ink-stained hands clutched his notebook, the stories he had poured his life into still etched on the pages. Behind him, Finn emerged, quiet and steady, though his eyes flickered with the same unease that gripped them all. The wolf's gaze swept over the three of them. "To find the tree, each of you must leave behind what you hold most dear. The forest does not open its heart without proof of yours." Elias hesitated, clutching his notebook tightly. "This is everything I've written," he said softly. His stories had been his voice in a world that often ignored him, his way of making himself heard. Mara glanced at him, then at Finn, who stood silently, his hand brushing the compass at his side. She could see the reluctance in his movements, though his face betrayed no emotion. The compass was more than an object. It was his map to a world he couldn't quite put into words. The wolf growled again, impatient. "Decide," it said, "or the forest will decide for you." Mara closed her eyes, her fingers tightening around the locket. She had carried it for so long, the weight of her sister's memory tethered to its silver chain. But the wish tree lay ahead, and her sister's absence had carved a void that could only be filled by the impossible. With trembling hands, she unclasped the locket and held it out to the wolf. The air seemed to shudder as she released it, as though the forest itself acknowledged her offering. The wolf took it gently in its jaws, then turned its gaze to Elias. He hesitated, his fingers brushing the worn edges of the notebook. "These are my dreams," he whispered, his voice heavy with reluctance. But after a long moment, he stepped forward, placing the notebook before the wolf. The beast nodded, its golden eyes gleaming with quiet approval. Finally, it was Finn's turn. Mara and Elias watched as he reached for the compass. For a moment, his hand hovered over it, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he unclasped it and set it down in the snow. The wolf stared at him for a long moment before speaking. "You give with silence," it said, "but your heart speaks loudly." It turned, its silver fur shimmering in the lantern light, and with a flick of its tail, the path ahead unraveled. The shadows receded, revealing a faint trail that glowed softly, like the edge of a dream. The three friends followed, the weight of their sacrifices heavy in the cold air. The forest grew stranger as they walked. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches forming intricate patterns overhead. The mist thickened, swirling around their feet and rising like spectral fingers. Every now and then, they glimpsed flickers of movement, figures that danced just beyond the edge of the light, their forms shifting like reflections on water. "What are those?" Mara whispered, her voice barely audible. Elias's gaze followed hers, his brow furrowing. "Memories," he said finally. "Or maybe possibilities." Finn remained silent, though his eyes lingered on the flickering shapes. Mara noticed the way his jaw tightened, as though he were holding back words he could not bring himself to speak. As they walked, the forest seemed to whisper to them, its voice a murmur of secrets and half-forgotten truths. Mara thought she heard her sister's laughter again, faint and distant, and her heart ached with the pull of it. Elias caught fragments of his stories, spoken in voices not his own, and Finn, though he said nothing, seemed to grow quieter still, his steps slower, his gaze heavier. At last, the forest opened into a clearing, and there it stood, the wish tree. It towered above them, its branches stretching impossibly high, adorned with leaves that glowed like molten silver. Its roots twisted and coiled through the ground, pulsing faintly as though alive. The air around it was thick with magic, a presence so overwhelming that it was difficult to breathe. The friends stopped in their tracks, the sight of the tree filling them with awe and trepidation. "This is it," Elias whispered, his voice trembling. "The wish tree." The tree seemed to hum in response, its branches swaying gently though there was no wind. The friends stepped closer, their hearts pounding, as the forest's whispers faded into an expectant silence. But the tree, they knew, was not yet theirs to claim. Its presence was powerful, but it was also watchful, waiting for them to prove themselves worthy. They had come so far, but the greatest challenge lay ahead. The question of what they would wish for, and the price they would pay. The wish tree stood before them, a colossus of silver and shadow, its light weaving 1,000 threads into the cold night. Its branches hummed faintly, resonating with a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of their hearts. The air around it was thick and electric, as if the tree itself breathed, exhaling centuries of unspoken desires. Mara, Elias, and Finn approached slowly, the weight of the journey pressing down on their shoulders. The sacrifices they had made, the locket, the notebook, the compass, seemed distant now, mere echoes of a price already paid. Yet the presence of the tree made it clear that their trials were not yet over. A low hum grew in the air, rising and falling like a chant. The tree's voice wasn't a sound but a sensation, filling their minds with its resonance. To wish is to give shape to the soul, it intoned, its words not spoken but felt. Your heart speaks louder here than your tongue ever could. The wish must be true, selfless and resolute. Step forward and let the truth be revealed. The three friends exchanged uncertain glances. Each carried a wish, a longing that had drawn them to this place, yet the tree's warning echoed in their minds. One wish. Only one. Mara stepped forward first, her eyes fixed on the shimmering leaves that seemed to pulse with life. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. I wish for my sister to return, she said, her words cutting through the stillness. I wish to see her again, to bring her back to the world. The tree's light dimmed for a moment, as though considering her request. Its voice returned, softer this time. Your wish carries the weight of love, but also of loss. What is lost cannot be regained without cost. Would you sacrifice another to bring her back? Mara's breath caught. Sacrifice another, she whispered. Life is a circle, child, the tree replied. For one to return, another must take her place. Her knees weakened, the truth of the price striking her like a blow. She stepped back, tears streaming down her face. I can't, she murmured. I can't pay that price. Elias placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch steadying her. Then he stepped forward, clutching the faint memory of his notebook in his mind. He looked up at the tree, his voice filled with quiet determination. I wish for my stories to come alive, he said. For them to inspire others, to bring joy and wonder to the world. The tree's light flickered, its hum deepening. Your wish is noble, dreamer, but it is not without consequence. To give life to your stories, you must surrender your own voice. Are you willing to speak no more so that your tales may sing? Elias froze, his mind racing. Words were his lifeblood, his very essence. To lose his voice would mean losing himself, even if it meant his stories lived on. He took a step back, his head bowed. No, he whispered. I can't. Finally, Finn moved forward. He had stood silent through the journey, his wish locked away, unspoken even to himself. The tree's hum grew quieter as he approached, as if it were waiting, watching. He raised his gaze, meeting the shimmering branches with eyes filled not with fear but resolve. "I wish for hope," he said, his voice firm and clear. "Hope for us, for our village, for a world that sometimes forgets it. I wish for light in the darkness, even when we cannot see it." The tree stilled, its branches ceasing their sway. Its voice, when it came, was quieter, almost reverent. "Your wish does not seek to mend your own heart, but to mend the hearts of others. It carries no self, no fear, no regret. It is the wish the world needs most." The light around the tree brightened, washing over the clearing and casting their faces in silver radiance. Mara and Elias turned to Finn, their expressions shifting from disbelief to awe. The tree's hum deepened, resonating through their bones as its branches began to shed their leaves. Each leaf fell like a shard of starlight, dissolving as it touched the ground. The air grew warmer, softer, as if the magic of the tree had seeped into the world itself. The tree spoke again, its voice a whisper in the silence. "The wish is granted. Hope shall endure, even in the shadow of despair. You have given freely, and the gift shall spread beyond your knowing." Finn stepped back, his face calm, his breath steady. The wish tree's light began to dim, its branches folding inward as though retreating into itself. The clearing grew quiet again, the magic fading into the edges of the forest. The three friends stood together, their journey complete. Mara reached for Finn's hand, her voice filled with gratitude and sorrow. "You gave something we couldn't, Finn," she said. "Something the world truly needed." Elias nodded, his voice heavy with emotion. "We came here with our own wishes, but yours was the one that mattered." The wish tree's glow remained faint, a beacon in the distance as they turned to leave. Though they carried no physical proof of the journey, they felt its impact, like a song they could not hear, but would always remember. As they walked back through the forest, the air seemed lighter, the shadows less menacing. The wish tree had given its gift, and its magic lingered. Not in silver leaves or whispered promises, but in the quiet strength of hope that would carry them forward. The path leading out of the shrouded forest felt different, as though the air itself had shifted. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on Mara, Elias and Finn during their journey was gone, replaced by a strange stillness, almost reverent. The forest, though still vast and shadowed, no longer loomed. It felt alive but not menacing, a presence that watched but did not intrude. None of them spoke as they walked, their lanterns casting faint orbs of light that seemed unnecessary now. The darkness no longer felt suffocating. It was soft, like a quiet companion guiding them home. Yet each of them carried something more than the echoes of the wish tree's magic. They carried the weight of its revelations. Mara clutched her scarf where her locket had once rested. the absence of its familiar weight a reminder of what she had lost and what she had nearly sacrificed. Her sister's voice still echoed faintly in her mind, mingling with the question that had haunted her since she had first spoken her wish. Would the price have been worth it? She knew the answer now. No, she thought. Not like that. Elias walked beside her, his hands empty without the notebook he had surrendered. For the first time in years, his mind felt quiet, not filled with the ceaseless whirl of stories and dreams, but something simpler, calmer. He had always believed his words could shape the world, that his stories could bring it to life. But the tree's question had cut to the core of his being. Who would he be without his voice? And now, in the silence, he wondered if the stories mattered less than he had imagined. Or perhaps they mattered most because they were his, spoken freely and without condition. Finn led the way, his steps steady and deliberate. He had not looked back at the wish tree as they left, nor did he seem burdened by what had transpired. But there was something different about him now, a quiet certainty in the way he moved, as if the tree's light still flickered within him. His wish had been selfless, and in that selflessness he had found something neither Mara nor Elias could quite name: hope. The edge of the forest appeared ahead, the village's faint lights glowing like distant stars through the trees. The sight was almost jarring after the timeless vastness of the forest. It reminded them of the world they had left behind, the one they would return to, changed, though it remained the same. As they stepped out from beneath the forest's canopy, the snow fell gently around them, its silence a welcome reprieve from the hum of the tree. The village looked as it always had, small and unassuming, its rooftops buried in snow, its chimneys exhaling thin ribbons of smoke. But to the three friends it felt new, as if they were seeing it through different eyes. The villagers had long since retreated indoors, their windows glowing with the warm light of fires and candles. Christmas Eve was nearly over, and soon the dawn would come, bringing with it another year. Mara, Elias, and Finn stood at the edge of the village, the forest shadows behind them, the familiar streets ahead. "What now?" Mara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "We go back," he said simply. "Back to the village, to our lives, but maybe we go back differently." Finn looked at them both, his face calm but resolute. "The tree's gift wasn't just for us," he said. "It was for everyone. Hope doesn't belong to one person. It's something we carry, something we share." His words settled over them like the falling snow, soft yet profound. Mara nodded, though her heart still ached for the wish she could not make. She realized now that her journey had not been about bringing her sister back, but about finding the strength to carry her memory forward. Elias, too, seemed to understand that his stories would not fade simply because he had left his notebook behind. They lived within him, waiting to be told. The three friends walked into the village together, their footprints weaving a single path through the fresh snow. The streets were quiet, the houses dark, save for the occasional flicker of light from a window. But there was something in the air, a subtle shift, a feeling of anticipation that none of them could explain, but all of them could feel. As they reached the village square, the church bell tolled softly, signaling the arrival of midnight. Christmas Eve had passed, and Christmas Day had begun. The sound echoed across the snow-covered rooftops, a clear, resonant note that seemed to carry the weight of the wish tree's promise. Mara glanced up at the sky, where the stars shone bright and unwavering. "Do you think anyone will ever know what we did?" she asked, her voice quiet. Finn shook his head. "It doesn't matter," he said. "The tree wasn't for us to claim. It was for the world. And the world will feel its gift, even if it doesn't know where it came from." Elias smiled faintly, the first real smile he had felt since they had stepped into the forest. "Stories have a way of spreading," he said. "Maybe one day someone will tell this one. Maybe it will find its way back to the tree." The three of them stood in silence for a moment, the snow falling softly around them. And though they could not see it, far behind them, deep within the shrouded forest, the wish tree stood still, its branches quiet but alive, waiting for the next Christmas Eve, waiting for the next wish, waiting for the next flicker of hope.